Hey, I'm Chris Charla here at Dice Reykjavik, and welcome to the Game Maker's Notebook. Today we're talking to Arne Meyer about his path from making fanzines and starting a record label in college, all the way through Xbox, Vivendi, and finally 15 years at Naughty Dog, doing everything from community management to understanding exactly what a head of culture does. I guess just to get started, thanks for coming and everything. You've been in games a long time, but what was your first, I'll ask the first game you played, but what was the first game you remember seeing or knowing about or just being aware of?
Oh, seeing or knowing? We moved to the United States when I was 4. And so we moved into a college town and we went to a pizza parlor.
Where'd you come from?
I lived in Venezuela, so I was born in Venezuela. We lived in a college town. My dad was going to grad school, and so we went to a pizza parlor. And of course, there was a sit-down arcade. So, funny enough, the first game I was aware of, which is the one I played, was Pac-Man. And even the guy that was running the slice counter would give me quarters from their tip jar, so I could just keep playing because I was just so engrossed with it. Yeah,
that is super cool.
Yeah.
So that's the first game you knew about, and the first game you played. And did you ever get to the intermission? I assume?
No, I was terrible at Pac-Man. I never figured out, the whole thing about where the ghosts were sort of, which ones were following you, which ones were moving away from you. Never figured that out. I was terrible. But that is where I got the start on that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And when did you first think about games as like a career?
Oh, man. It was probably more in high school. I had a really good friend of mine who we were on BBSs together. And,
nice.
We were doing in the Art Underground and things like that, and logging into Usenet and reading all the forums, the alt.music whatever. And we were playing a lot of Wing Commander at that point. So this was, I guess, pretty late high school. And one of the things we like to do is we get a hex editor, and nobody was encrypting all of their code. So we would tweak, the thrust value on Wing Commander, so we could do infinite thrust basically. And so we started going, this is really interesting, that there was more to it than, just buying a game and playing it. And we both thought, hey, this is sort of software, internet, things like that started to be into our interest. And I was like, well, we were trying to figure out, okay, what do we do? And we wanted to get in the business together. I think that's really what it was. It was hey, we wanted to run our own company, something related with software. And we both thought we were going to go off and be computer engineers. He achieved that. I did not. I didn't get into any computer engineering schools and just went to a liberal arts school. But that was, it was around that time we were hey, let's do something together. Let's become computer engineers and write code.
Cool. Well, I think you've proven that liberal arts is an acceptable pathway into the game industry, which I back 100%. So you went to University of Chicago?
I did.
And while you were there, I did this too, so I'm curious to hear how your experience went. You started a record label.
I did. Yeah.
Tell us all about Major Label Records, which is an amazing, amazing studio or label name.
Sure. Well, it's really funny because I was listening to some of your podcasts a while back, and I was like, is this whole podcast going to be about punk and making zines, and instead of talking about games and stuff like that? So I figured we might head in that direction. I was really big into the ska scene.
Oh, nice.
Along with punk, but a lot of my friends in Chicago were in ska bands and stuff like that. And there was a band that I really, really loved, and I wanted to support them. And around the time I was lightly also doing promotion. It was I'm already overselling what I was doing at that point, because it was basically I was calling up bands and being hey, do you want to play? And working with another promoter to actually book the venue. But I guess I was arranging the bands. But there was a band there called Greenhouse that I really, really loved. One of the guys went to my school. There's another guy that he was a keyboard player. He was a DJ, amazing DJ name too. He was DJ Butterknife because he cuts so sharp,
That's amazing.
So they just didn't have the ability or the funds to fully make an album. So I agreed that we'd get together. It was me and this guy. We just got together and we pooled some money together so that they could go record the album. And so we said, hey, we're just starting the record label. And we're trying to figure out what to call it. And we called it Major Label Records. So they recorded the album, and I was a little bit more involved in in making the booklet for it. And those guys ran riot with the funds that we were giving them. I kid you not. it was like a 26-page full color booklet for this thing. We spent so much money on the booklet. It was like absolutely insane. But we released it, and that was our only release. But we ended up selling the license, I guess, to another local big ska label called Jump Up that was run by Chuck Wren. So he did the pressings after that. But what was really great is we even booked a record release party. I booked all of my favorite bands from like Minnesota and Chicago, and they all came together for a big awesome. Release party. And we sold out the venue, which is the Metro, which is a pretty big venue in Chicago.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
I was into ska. Like Megan makes fun of me because she likes punk and I like punk, but I came from a ska background and she comes from, I don't know, some other background. That's super cool. And so after that, you talk to me about this. I don't know, it was a zine or a magazine, but Toxic Shock? Toxic Culture Shock?
What was it? Did I say Toxic Culture Shock?
Total Culture Shock.
Total Culture Shock.
Sorry.
Because it's a ska lyric.
Okay.
Because you're the only Rudy on the block. It's a total culture shock, the only Rudy on the block, which is really lame when you really think about it later. Be like, this is what I'm going to call my zine. Around the same time with the record label, I was reading a lot of zines anyway. It was really interesting because you could go into Tower Records and they had the curated zine section. So I'd be picking up all of these things. And I was like, well, I really like ska. I like the scene here in Chicago. And there isn't a lot of publications around it. And I was reading zines from, again, Minnesota and New York. Moon Records had their sort of zine on there as well. So I was like, well, let's start one here. I was in college, so I had access to free photocopies and things like that. So mine was a little bit more professional. Like there was a lot of desktop editing, and it wasn't as cut and paste. But I liked covering the local scene. I got writers to do it for free, and ended up being completely ad supported. So it'd be like writing even record labels that weren't in ska. So like, well, Epitaph was, but I got Kill Rock Stars to advertise. And it blew my mind because I was like, I'm a nothing zine in a city, but they would give me like $20 for, a little bit of advertising space in there.
Awesome.
And so it was completely free, and I'd go to shows with a messenger bag with like 400 zines and just hand them out to anyone who would want it.
And how did you, okay, so now we're going to get a little, I promise we'll talk about video games in a minute. Like we will get to video games, but I'm super curious, like how was the zine printed? Was it newsprint? Was it like offset or?
It was total photocopy. So what I was able to do, because this was a college, I could bring in the digital files and they would stick it in this like massive Xerox machine that would make like 1,000 copies. And it felt like it was like 10 minutes, like something insane. So it was a total photocopy.
And were did you pay for these copies or were they like labor donated?
They were labor donated.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah. That's awesome. All the trade. Yeah.
That's super cool. And I think like, in the era when you went to college, starting a zine, starting a label was kind of the equivalent today of having your own TikTok or whatever. And it's super cool. And so post-college, you start working at Edelman right away?
Yeah, at Edelman. I graduated college. So the thing was, I was thinking, well, if I'm not going to become a computer engineer, the other way to sort of go into business was to become an economics major. And despite I did pretty good academically in high school, I did not achieve anything in economics. I pretty much failed out of that program. And so I went to public policy, which actually really spoke a lot to me because I was doing a paper on the National Endowment for the Arts and talking about public arts funding. And I was actually taking classes at the same time at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago for filmmaking. So there was an art side that I really liked to it. So after college, I was trying to figure out what do I do for a job. And I just happened to luck into public relations because the web was really interesting to me. And there was a public relations firm that was interviewing, and they just happened to have somebody leave in their web division, and that turned out to be Edelman.
That's awesome. And then for folks who don't know, Edelman does the PR for Xbox, among other things. Yeah. Did you end up with Xbox as a client right away, or did it take a minute for that to happen?
So when I joined, they were the agency of record for some other Microsoft stuff, mouse and keyboards, and I think it was Travelocity at some point too, or Expedia. I forgot who they owned. Expedia.
Yeah, I think Expedia.
And about 6 months in, every group, every department got pulled in because they were pitching for the launch of the original Xbox, and so we were trying to pitch ideas because that was not an account for them yet, and so. you can chalk it up to youthful hubris. I walked in, I was like, I've got some ideas, should know what gamers are interested into. I didn't quite do it that way, but thankfully to their credit, I wasn't so much of a jerk that I had a seat at the table and we all listened, we came up with ideas. And we pitched a campaign that actually started off with a Xbox Unleashed in-person event that was simultaneous in LA and New York. They loved it and gave Edelman the business, and I ended up working on the original Xbox launch and their first slate of first-party games.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
How did it feel? I guess I have a couple of questions about that. Just one is, how did it feel to be helping to build the launch of something, a new console, which is, has only happened 4 or 5 times in, a new console brand has only happened 4 or 5 times in history, and working with a big giant company. So I'm curious how that felt from kind of like the insider perspective.
Sure.
Because as fans, we've all sort of saw what happened. And then second, how did it feel from like, oh my gosh, I'm actually working in games, but I never learned how to program computers sort of perspective?
Yeah. I thought it was... What was really great about the team, and I even think when I think back on my career, I think that experience of working on the original Xbox launch really set into motion what I find really interesting in my career in games, which is I'm always around necessarily building things from scratch, but I like building things that haven't happened before, innovating. And the team on the Microsoft side, they understood there were underdogs. And they wanted to be scrappy. They wanted to do something that was different and really open to a lot of ideas on how to capture the gaming community. They'd had some experience with that with Microsoft Flight Simulator and Age of Empires on PC. But they understood, hey, how do we harness the community? And that actually ended up being really attractive to me. So being on the inside of that and saying, hey, there's a bunch of people who are willing to try new things, something different, and really cater to the gamer. My experience at that time was that wasn't something that was very common at that point. I could be wrong, but it just sort of felt like, hey, this is something, the start of something fresh and new in terms of approaching how to market a console in the game. So it felt really great to be part of a console that was like, hey, we're going to try something different in all areas and really try to innovate and do something special.
Cool. Was it weird at all? Just the Microsoft side of it, like you go from, I guess, the keyboard and mouse business and the, couple other businesses that Edelman had at the time to the game business. Were the people in the games group different than the other people you worked with at Microsoft?
I think they did that by design. They were completely different. They had an office in Bear Creek, so they were completely separate from the Microsoft campus. And it was filled with modern and contemporary art. There was a completely different feel to it. So I think in every set of my experience and my contact with what they were doing, they were being very intentional about, we're different. We're not Microsoft. We're innovative. Again, we're scrappy. We're the underdogs. And I think that went down to the point of like, we're having a separate campus so that we're not, we're keeping the energy and the enthusiasm and the ideas separate from maybe interference or, at least sort of the bigger corporate machine.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And then as kind of like a game player and game fan, how did it feel to be on the inside of that kind of thing?
Well, I mean, this was my first experience in that sort of thing. So getting preview discs and, a dev kit was the best thing in the world. I don't even know how to describe it when I think about it, because at the time it was just like, we're struggling to be like, oh, let's understand these games. Let's figure out how to market it. But to sit there and get early versions of the games when I've never had that experience before, felt really interesting. It's something that really motivated me to go, okay, how can we take the learnings that we're getting this early on and having this transparency from the developers and from the publisher and create programs or to create messages that really work with our community. So how do I take this excitement of having this early access and go, let's share this with the community and find ways to do that.
Cool. And at some point you moved from Chicago to Seattle?
Yeah. So after the Xbox launch, I worked on and off on the games that had come out afterwards. I think it was like Oddworld was some of them, and Halo and DOA. But I also was still working on regular PR projects. So I was working for like an aquarium and craft and financial services and things like that. And after a while, things were ramping up for 360. And our group got involved again, sort of the online group, and we were doing digital PR, we're building websites and working with communities. So our group got pulled in again, and we actually pitched an ARG that was called the Colony, if anyone remembers that. And that ended up also going over really well because it was very community centric. Again, it was building up grassroots interest. And the idea for the ARG was that it would, if everything got solved, it would end up with a video that was unlocked online that basically gave everybody, I don't know, a 30-minute preview to the launch of the announcement of the 360 before it was announced at E3. So we ended up doing that. And again, that was seen as successful enough that there was an opportunity for me to move to Seattle instead of flying out there all the time, to actually build up a community practice inside the PR agency, take in some of the community work that Microsoft was doing and partner with their sort of burgeoning community team as well, and sort of build a new practice up from scratch.
Cool. And you did that. And were you at the E3 with the Xbox 360 announce?
I was not at the E3 for the 360 announce. Maybe I'm trying to remember timelines here, and this feels bad because it's like my memory's starting to go. There was an event at the Grauman Theater where they had games. I think that was after the 360. Or no, that wouldn't have been because I moved to Seattle for the launch. So I was at the E3 with the 360 announce.
Where you got the faceplate? There was a faceplate that they gave out like at the E3 before the system launched. So.
Well, I didn't get to go in the theater because I was working. So I don't remember which E3 this is. So let's assume it's that E3. There was across the street at the Roosevelt Hotel, there was an event afterwards for all the journalists to go to. So I was helping actually set up all of the games and wrangle people through. So I didn't get the chance to see the actual E3 event, but I got to hang out in the aftermath with all the developers that were getting ready to do interviews with all the press. So that was actually really fascinating because I think that was also my first real press event outside of Xbox Unleashed.
That's awesome. And then as you started to, you've been now in PR for 5-6 years. Did you start to have that desire to just be more involved with games like directly, or how did that go?
Yeah. Well, so after moving to Seattle, what was great about now being able to focus mostly on video games is I was getting more of the full 360. That's such a bad pun. I was getting the full breadth of what it's like to work at a publisher and a console maker. I was working on hardware. I was working on Xbox Live Arcade. I was working on Xbox Live, all of the first-party games, and even the second-party published games. When I look back on it, that workkeep seems insane. I don't know how we did it.
Now we have different divisions for each of those.
Oh, yeah. Well, and even thinking keeping up with the workload to launch one game at Naughty Dog is so much. I can't imagine how I was splitting my time across all of that. And we had a team. Obviously, it wasn't by myself, but I was having to do the meetings and pay attention to all of that. I already forgot your question.
Something video game. Just getting closer to the teams.
Getting closer to the games. So that was the first time I had an opportunity to take a look at the full breadth of like the machine that's involved in a console maker just putting out games. And it was allowing me to be closer to how developers were making games as well. We had meetings with Dennis Dyack and I already forgot what his game was called. It's really terrible. My memory is failing me today, especially when I was talking about other stuff. But we were able to go into to meetings with developers, and they're showing us previews of games. And that was when I was starting to realize that there is something attractive about being further or closer to game developers than the PR side. But I didn't know where to go next. I think that was the big thing. Is like I really liked what I was doing. I had a really fun team around me, really great people I was working with at Microsoft. But there was an itch that was starting to develop from that.
And we'll get to that itch, which you have eventually scratched, so spoilers. But you were building like a community practice at Xbox, and this was just at that 360 era, that 2005, 2006 kind of era, is just when somehow the notion of like community management actually like sprang from the ether. Because I think before that, as a fan, games just showed up that just showed up, and maybe there was an ad and maybe there wasn't, and you didn't know anything about them. And can you talk a little bit about just how you built that kind of community practice and the early blog stuff? Because I think it was like, it's the troubling thing about it is that today, to describe how innovative it was, it seems so obvious, but like the kids don't know that before that, like there was just nothing.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, there was a little bit of community work before that. I think that was sort of the inflection point of really paying attention to and seeing the value of the community. So as I said, Microsoft and even other companies understood the value of going on forums, but everything was very decentralized. There wasn't a real focus on doing that. I think some graphics cards and, like I said, Microsoft Flight Simulator and Age of Empires was the closest example I got to. There were people who were working the forums, representing the company and sort of reporting back the voice of the community. So there was a little burgeoning effort there that, as we got into the 360 era, I think, and all the other consoles that came out at that point, GameCube, I think, was a little bit earlier. They were doing consumer and community events. They realized that there was value to creating ambassadorship. So the early versions of influencers, which is really funny because we never called them influencers, we called them ambassadors. And I think it was also an extension of Microsoft at that point. It was also running an ambassador program for some of their other businesses. And it all seemed to sort of come together and go, hey, there's value here in building this grassroots discussion around your games and actually bringing back the opinions and feedback from players of your game back into how it shapes your marketing efforts or how it shapes your game even more directly. And so creating that two-way conduit at the time really felt, as you're saying, it really felt natural. It really felt like that's something that it's a no-brainer to do. But there wasn't a playbook for that at that point. And one of the things that started to kick that off and I think sort of have developers and other folks understand the value of it was that we would include community members that were starting to run their own blog. So there was a lot of self-publishing around that time. And I think that was part of it. They were running some blogs, they were running fan sites. And you go back and I liked zines and this seemed like there was something there. We would invite them, as we would with other press, to come visit developers. And there was a game I was working on where it was unknown what kind of market there would be for that. They were working on an IP that was very different. They were working on an IP, but the game was very different than what people would think for the IP. It was an RPG, and they were creating a shooter, which you think back, they were probably far ahead of the curve. If they'd come out with that right now, where it was more of a battle royale type game, it could have been live service. But they were working on a shooter, and they didn't know how that would go over. So what we did is we brought in people who were ambassadors, who could be ambassadors, who were running fan sites, to come play the game. And I think we all saw the value of, hey, that direct contact, that conversation that we're starting to have there was really interesting. And it really, again, it spoke to me. I loved the fanzine, the fan site feel to it. It was an area that people were not paying attention to, but it was something that I was involved in. I was reading all the time. And we were doing podcasts. I mean, this was even early podcasts. I was listening to podcasts at that point. And there was something there that we weren't tapping into.
That's cool. And you helped Microsoft build that up, and it this is I work at Xbox now, but I didn't work at Xbox then.
Yeah.
But just as a fan, just getting to see it, it really did feel different, and it felt special. I don't know. Congratulations, because you definitely made the Xbox 360 feel super, super
Sure.
cool in a way that was, I don't know. It's hard to explain.
Well, thank you. I mean, that it feels very humbling. I mean, this was clearly a big team effort with a lot of people who believed in it, both at Edelman and at Microsoft, and even the marketers and the PR folks at Microsoft also believed in it. So everyone was being very open-minded, and I think without that collective desire to do something different, this wouldn't have existed. So I definitely can't take credit for it, but it was really exciting to be contributing to it and to be part of it.
Yeah, definitely. So why'd you leave? Because you end up leaving Microsoft in a couple of years after 360 launches?
Yeah, this is a little bit more boring, but Microsoft really saw the value and they wanted to invest in it. And this was around the time that Major Nelson came onto the scene. They were building a Xbox blog internally, and it really seemed that business and the opportunity was shifting more internally. And I probably, this is probably my fault, but I didn't even try whether I could go internally, but it was just moving away. And I saw that there wasn't much of a future for me there. Working on Xboxes was sort of moving away and going inside to Microsoft. But I'd made some really great contacts in the work that I'd done. And around the time that the writing was on the wall, and I wasn't planning on going anywhere. I hadn't figured out my next steps, or even if I wanted to have a next step. One of the people that I'd worked with at Microsoft on the Xbox Live and Xbox Live Arcade work, Amy Blair, had already moved to LA and was working for Vivendi Games, and they're publishing under the Sierra label. And she asked me if I was interested in working with her. And I had a really great experience working on the agency side with her. So I said, hey, I'd be interested, let's chat. And I went down to interview with them, and they were kind of in the similar boat. They'd done some community work. They had some MMOs on the Sierra side. Obviously, Blizzard was a whole separate beast for them. They had some MMOs on the Sierra side where they were, again, doing some community work, but they really wanted to do more and take it to the next level on the publishing side. And it spoke to me. It was, again, sort of building something up from, not really scratch, but building something that was much bigger and more sophisticated than that was there before. And that opportunity spoke to me. And again, she was such a great partner to work with. I was like, let's try this out. And so I jumped at it and moved to LA to work for Vivendi.
That's awesome. And did you when did you start to become more of a public face? Was it at Vivendi?
Oh, that's a really great question. I actually think it may have been afterwards, as far as the real public. I think before then, even in the 360 era, my contact was with fan sites. So I wasn't necessarily giving interviews, but I was definitely the liaison.
Yeah, you were
to folks. Yeah.
Everybody.
I was pretty well known, I guess, is what I was saying.
You were super well known in the industry as like the person to talk to if you had a website or you had a blog or that kind of thing. But yeah, you weren't necessarily Major Nelson. You weren't like consumer facing public face.
I did try though, because I did run a blog as part of my work, and I was mentioning this yesterday with the Sam Lake. I got in trouble for talking a little bit too much about a game. So I was trying to say, hey, there are people here that are that want to interact with our community, that want to have a little bit more of that face, that they're actually people behind everything. But I guess to go back on the Vivendi side, it was still very much a lot of the same. So it was still working with fan sites. It was also really funny because we'd be working with sites that were not considered worthy enough to be working with a regular PR team. But now you look back on it and it's like, oh, this is it was a press center. It was like Joystick and Kotaku, but those were not part of the actual PR machine. So you'd be working through that on the community side and bringing them to events, interacting with them. So I was still continuing to do that work throughout Vivendi. But again, I was still sort of building the contacts and having people that, wow, I'm really messing this up. I was still building the contacts and building up a reputation with the people I worked with, that I was trustworthy and authentic and transparent. So that even if I couldn't go on record with my own name, I could give them the information. I could, sort of clue them in terms of like what was happening.
Yeah. That's really cool. I think that to me, the thing that really resonates with what you said is that, you're working with these sites that were sort of under the radar, or not under the radar, but under the fold line, right? Like they weren't the big important sites, so to speak. But it turns out they actually were probably the most influential sites, because they were the sites that the fans who wanted more than they could get from the mainstream sites would go to get the real dirt, and it's just a really interesting. It must have been a really interesting strategy or just experience to navigate, where it's like, oh, well, now we've got somebody else talking to the big site. Talk to those guys. And then, but those guys are the ones who are actually driving, those are the guys who the big sites are reading to figure out what they should put on their front page. So
yeah, absolutely. And it's even funny when you go back and you look at people that I was working with on fan sites, the careers that they've built, because they try to say this. I don't want to take credit that I had any sort of significant impact on their career trajectory, but because they felt that someone was listening to them and paying attention to them, opened up their thoughts that there would be opportunities for them. A good friend of mine, Nick Sutner, he and his buddy ran an Xbox fan site in Chicago, and through giving them code and giving them interviews, he felt like, hey, there's a career here, and he moved to San Francisco to get a job at GameSpot, and that was just the beginning of his career. And like now he's at Panic and working on Playdate, which is like really amazing to think that if you really cultivate these fan sites, these people who are really passionate about games, they could have a contribution, they could have a career in games that maybe they would have never thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I was having a conversation the other day here at DICE with someone just talking about working with influencers or creators on the YouTube side and the TikTok side, but not the big ones. Like they're just like the smaller the better, because those are the people who are really passionate, and those are the people who, if they have 800 or 2,000 fans, it's like those 2,000 fans are like really keyed in and paying attention. And so I think it's interesting that strategy is still working and still feels like kind of like a secret strategy, even though, you knew this strategy, however many years ago, 15 years ago. And I started at IGN, but before it existed. And we were kind of that below the fold thing because we weren't a magazine.
Right.
And, the PR people who interacted with us, you remembered, and it was a real relationship that like paid dividends later for both parties.
Well, I think it's really gratifying when you start working with the smaller influencers or having more direct contact with the community, because they're so passionate. They're so authentic with their love of what you're working on, the games that you're on. And that's really motivating all the time. And I think that's something that is really important when you do work at a developer or publisher, when you're talking about, hey, there's that two-way conversation, to bring in that excitement to the people who are working on it. Because when you're heads down, you're working on a game for 3 to 5 years, you might not realize that there's this love for what you do, this intense love for what you do on the other side of it. And to have a pathway to bring that into the people who are working on it and to yourself is really motivating. It just gives you all that energy.
Yeah, it is. It's huge. It's one of the big reasons I tell people to still, go to PAX, because it's like, okay, maybe the ROI on how many people play your game, blah, blah, blah. Like maybe it's hard, but the ROI on seeing somebody like smile when they're playing your game and seeing where they smile when they're playing your game, like you can't. It's, first of all, super energizing, and second of all, you just know so much more about your game when you see it.
Absolutely.
So you, at this point in your career, you've worked on the PR side. You've worked on kind of the agency side for games and done some cool stuff. Now you've worked on the publisher side, and then Naughty Dog.
Yeah, and then Naughty Dog. It was funny. I was working at Vivendi, and I woke up on a Sunday morning and to the news that Vivendi and Activision were merging. It was about 3 months after I moved there. And not long thereafter, I got a call from my boss, who was basically like, I'm sorry, I had no idea. We just moved you down here, and all of a sudden your future feels like it might be in question, or you don't know what it is. And I will give credit to my boss at that point. She was incredibly supportive of figuring out what was next, whether or not that meant going on to Activision or anything else. And she was lining up all of these job interviews for me. Some really massive companies now that at that point were just being a startup, which I will not name, but it was just really fascinating that she was helping me out that much and being very transparent. She was asking me how my interviews were going, helping me prep a little bit. And outside of that, Naughty Dog came calling. They were starting work on Uncharted 2. They were building a multiplayer component to it, and they knew that they wanted to have more community contact and have that two-way conversation and build an online community from it, because they knew they had passionate fans for many, many years. So I interviewed with them, and again, I think back and the boss I had at Vivendi is one of the best ones I've ever had, because again, she was so supportive with everything. She used to be the product manager for Crash Bandicoot at Sony a long time, so she knew.
This is Amy, right?
This is Amy Blair, yeah. So she knew Evan, so she called up Evan and put in a good word for me and sort of sealed the deal. But I was really excited to, when I was doing the interview process, to sort of learn what was next. I thought Uncharted was really groundbreaking for what they were doing on the character side. I was sitting on the forums at E3 with everyone going, "Oh, look at the rust on the bars. That must mean, they're near the ocean and the salt and the corrosion." So all these details that were being pulled out. So I really believed in what was going next. So it was really great that there was a sort of serendipitous convergence of they came calling, Amy had worked with them, and that we could make it happen.
That's awesome. Yeah. I mean, I think it speaks to one of the interesting things in games, which is it's a big industry, but it's also a small community. And if you're a stand-up person, I don't know another word to put it, bad things can happen, or unforeseen events can happen, but you've got that community behind you who can help you find your way into the next role. And you've been at Naughty Dog for like 16 years, 15 years, something like a long time.
15 years, this year.
That's awesome. And take us through just the I want to try and ask these questions without super fanning out on just Uncharted. But take us through the kind of, because you've had a couple different roles at Naughty Dog, but take us through just like how that's worked.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, when I started at Naughty Dog, they hadn't announced Uncharted 2 yet, and they knew they were working on a multiplayer component. And I had come in saying, "Hey, we'll help you build a community. We'll start working on those smaller sites that were below the fold," as you put it, as a way to really draw attention to what they're trying to do with Uncharted 2. I think we all felt like Uncharted was something special. Uncharted Drake's Fortune was something special, but it maybe didn't quite get the attention that we felt it deserved. As a fan, it probably didn't feel that way. It was one of the best games for PS3 at that time, but it felt like there was much more that was untapped there. And so I came in going, "Hey, I'm going to do what I've done before, which I really love, which is how do we build a community practice? How do we engage with a community that hasn't been engaged heavily from scratch? And how do we start that up?" And so we started building that. But I realized early on, it boggles my mind that Evan, who was the co-president at the time, he was in all of the marketing meetings. He was in all of the PR meetings. He was reviewing assets that were coming in. He was doing all of this work that we could offload from him so he could focus on helping drive the creative vision of the game and support what Amy and Bruce were doing with the creative vision of the game. And I realized there's an opportunity here to really think about what is the role of somebody inside the studio to help all of these different facets, whether it's community, marketing, PR, licensing, anything that's consumer facing, anything that our players, our community interact with. It really should feel holistic and it should feel cohesive. But it really was born from, we should offload some of this work.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's weird is when I, look at your resume or look at you on LinkedIn, it's like, oh, director of communications at a studio. That makes sense. But actually it doesn't. I mean, it does. It does today. It makes perfect sense. But in 2000, I guess it was 2008 or 2007, or right around that era, like the idea that a studio that's working with a publisher would have its own director of communications was a little bit, I don't want to say radical, but it was not it actually wasn't the norm.
Yeah, I don't think it was something that was very common at that point. And even then, when I hear myself describe it, it was kind of born by accident, because the point was I was going to be the community manager, and it was more, hey, you've got a studio of about 100 people. There is more work. How do we focus the work in the areas that make sense for the people who are there? And a lot of it was really, let's offload the work from Evan and some of the other folks to someone who has experience with this, who can cultivate the relationships with Sony, who really understands how to translate what we're doing to our players and to our community, and be integral to that. So it was kind of an evolution of leveling up of what I feel that community should have always been. I think when you look back at that time, the community managers, the people who were doing community work always struggled to feel like they had a seat at the table with all the marketers and the PR folks. It always felt like that was secondary. And this felt an opportunity to go, no, this is what our place is here. And all of these pieces sort of fell into place at Naughty Dog.
Yeah. And you really built a new kind of model of community management or community relations, I would say. What the road wasn't without bumps. Like Naughty Dog had a couple bumps in the road. I mean, games are ridiculous, but how do you deal with times when you have bad press over this or that, and how do you deal with it both with the community and with the press to some extent, but also internally, because it's got to hurt the team, both because of what's happening and what's being said. How do you as somebody who cares about the studio, how do you address that?
Yeah, that's a really complex question that we'll try to unravel. I'll start with internally. So, we talked before about what's really great about working in the community is bringing in the enthusiasm to people who have their heads down, all the developers who have their heads down for years, who might not remember the passion that is out there and the love for what we do. And so when you do get a bit of a negative hit, a lot of it is thinking about morale building and getting people to really understand that what we're working on is special. I think I'm fortunate enough that the games we were working on there's something special to them, that everybody was really passionate and smart at the work that they're doing, that is in the game and you could see it, even if it wasn't there at an early point or closer to the final product. So a lot of it is really reminding people of the love there is for in general of what we do, and saying we're going to get there because we care about what we do. We care about the game. And it's helped again by just the incredible intelligence and passion of the people that you're surrounded with. But on the external side, I think the big thing is when you're working with, at least from my point of view, and this bears out internally, the big thing is being transparent and candid. If things aren't working, if an update to your multiplayer just isn't landing with your community, being transparent of saying, hey, we tried something and we see that it's not working or your reaction isn't, we'll take that back and we'll think about it. And if the change is not popular, why we would stick with that change. I remember there was an update we did to one of our multiplayer games that I think everyone has sat through, but we basically said, hey, here's why we made this update. Here's what we believed in, and at least being transparent about the reasons why we did to it. And I think that's the core of anything that we try to do, whether it's good or bad, is just maintaining that candor.
That's awesome. And now, career-wise, along the way, you become vice president. Community manager to vice president. Let's talk about that transition.
Yeah. So around 2006 or so, 2007, as we're ramping up work on The Last of Us Part 2, we'd grown incredibly in scale at Naughty Dog. I started there with about 75 or 100 people. We were now at about 400 people full-time working on the game. And one of the things I noticed, it wasn't just me, but one of the things I had come to notice as part of it is that a lot of our processes, a lot of the things that we're doing for our teams didn't really scale. We were a very organic studio. And I had the visibility of it because I was to this, because my boss was Evan. So I had direct contact in studio leadership, so I could hear and see what was happening and sort of what our concerns were. And we had a bit of a time where, as with any sort of development that's long, you've had ups and downs with morale. We were getting really busy, and maybe we weren't having company meetings as often. So our communication loop with everyone wasn't happening as frequently as possible. And we were hearing about it from our teams. And I started to think about, well, our team at Naughty Dog, everyone that works at Naughty Dog, is also a community. They might not be our player community, but they have desires and they have needs and they want to engage with the work and they want to engage with our studio. So why don't we take what we're thinking about? Why don't we take how we approach community externally and think about that internally? And how do we build a two-way communication loop? How do we build processes and structures and learning opportunities so that people feel that the people that work for us, our teams, feel like the studio cares about them, is engaged with them, and also listening. So it's really just shifting the community lens from outside to inside, but a lot of the key principles, the key ways to work were the same. And that started off a period where I was trying to think about, well, how do we start that? What are the sort of the key building blocks we need to put into place so that our team members feel like the studio is looking out for them long term?
Cool. And that eventually evolved into your current job title, which is Head of Culture and Communication.
That's correct.
There's a lot. I mean, first of all, that's I think probably a unique job title in the game industry, but maybe on Earth, which is pretty awesome. But there's just a lot to talk about there. How do you? I mean, and I have a million questions. Like I've worked at studios. I work at Xbox now, and managing your internal culture is like an endlessly fascinating, complex, insolvable, but always improvable kind of problem. But as Naughty Dog grew from, 100-person studio to a several 100-person studio, the culture, culture changes every day, right? But the culture inevitably changed. And how do you do it? How do you determine what culture you want? How do you determine, how you shape the culture and evolve the culture and yeah, I'll stop there because I have a follow-up question about how tiring it is, but I'll start there.
Well, we're lucky at Naughty Dog that the studio overall has been around for 40 years and 20 years plus since PlayStation has owned it. And so there's some very key principles about how the studio works that's very deeply ingrained, even if they weren't formalized or spoken about, that we're very iterative. We have a very collaborative environment. And there's some key things that have to make that work. For it to be collaborative and iterative, you have to create an environment of safety to try things and fail, to pivot, to provide feedback, and to be able to speak up. We frequently said great ideas can come from anywhere. And the idea is that you can talk to people outside of your discipline and either give them an idea or give them feedback on their work. So a lot of those things were very well established for a long time at the studio. It was more about going, how do we double down on that? How do we harness that and imbue that in everything that we do so that whether you've been at the studio for 3 weeks or you've been there for 15 years, you're always coming back to, hey, this is the core principles of what the studio is. And then taking that and going, there's an opportunity for you as someone at the studio to grow, to actually leverage all of these principles and say, there's a career for you here long-term, as long as you, not as necessarily as long, but by sticking with these principles, there's a career for you here long-term. And what are those opportunities, and building everything around that. So it's a lot of constant communication about where the studio is headed and how do we do that? How do we stick to our core principles? And then it's going, as we build a career path for people, as we start thinking about that there's leads who are managing people and directors who are managing people, that as people managers, they really model the behavior that you want and giving them the support and the education to improve. I mean, it goes with iteration. We can always get better. People management is a journey of learning, to give them the resources so that our people managers can really support the teams to bring their best selves at work. And that just extends to communicating the studio often about what our programs are in the future, what the future is of the studio, thinking about things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. We're really fortunate with the games that we have that we're bringing in all of these diverse voices and underrepresented groups, and they have unique needs in terms of how they need to be supported at the studio, or how the studio should be supporting them. So it's also thinking about, we're creating that two-way loop with them as well, that two-way conversation to go, here's an opportunity for you and here's how you can show up.
Yeah, it's It's a big task. As you do grow the studio from, the smaller studio, the folks who can remember maybe not all 40 years, but 30 years and maybe knew the founders and kind of were able to kind of just grok the original studio culture, to somebody who now is joining a multi-100 person studio that has this amazing legacy of games, but has only been there a few weeks. Do you find that you have to formalize how you document the culture?
Yeah, that is definitely part of the growing pains as you scale up that way. Is that learning by osmosis is far more difficult at that point, because, as you mentioned, culture shifts over time and often very unintentionally, where maybe some notion of what our core principles are might shift slightly, hopefully never into a point where it ends up being toxic, but it might not be the same experience for every single person. So what we have come to realize in the last couple of years, and I think the pandemic accelerated some of this, because not being in the same location is ripe for a drift of culture, sort of what's important for the studio, is going and sitting down. And we're working right now on formalizing what our values are. And it feels very corporate at the beginning, but we realize how important it is for someone to be able to go to an internal website or in our speech and have a concept that's easily graspable, that is the same across everywhere, so that people have a roadmap. Our team members have a roadmap in the face of ambiguity to follow. So that's one aspect of it. And I mentioned before, like we're creating all of these ways to support our people managers. And again, a lot of it's just trying to have this consistency of experience so that our culture remains very tight to what is successful for us.
Yeah, I think you didn't say the word, but what I'm hearing is that you guys the studio is very intentional about building the culture and trying to communicate the culture that you want to have, so that everybody feels that they're part of the same team.
Yeah, absolutely. We're being very intentional about every aspect, which I think is really great to see. And I talk to other studios, and it seems like we're all kind of in the same point. A lot of us are in the very same point, where we're realizing as we grow, as our projects get bigger and take longer, that we have to really think intentionally about every single thing that we're doing for our team members.
Yeah, it's really hard work. Like I have so much admiration for the work you're doing. I know exactly how hard it is, but it's also incredibly satisfying when you can, my guess is that it must be incredibly satisfying when you can really help keep a culture, healthy and strong, and see somebody starting, maybe they're right out of school, maybe they're, just folded their zine or whatever. And know that, they're starting at your studio, and hopefully they're going to, they have a chance that they might retire from your studio.
Yeah, that's the goal. And I think that's the thing that as a industry, perhaps we've been a little lax in thinking about, that we want to keep people working in these jobs for their entire lives if they want to. And frequently you hear about burnout, and you hear about people who are leaving, or how the industry is not very friendly. And I think that everyone I've come into contact doesn't want it to be that way. And it's really up to us to go, hey, to not only tell people who are starting in the industry, or people who have been here for a while, say, you can be here for life, or you can be at this company for life. But I think those of us that really feel strongly about it are in positions where we can affect that change. We just need to start sharing that information across studios, and really say, how can we do this better? And how can we tell people that there's a long-term career for them here? Because I've had the fortune of working at a company where we've had people who've been there for their entire history. I'd love everybody to feel that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it does come down to just being intentional about things, whether it's being intentionally inclusive, or just being very intentional about setting that culture, because you want people to want to stay at a company. Not that people don't grow and change and move, and of course you support people on their journey, but you want people to feel comfortable that they can stay someplace as long as they want, and don't feel like driven out, or just like miserable. So it's sorry, I think we're getting close to wrapping up. I don't want to end on a note of people being miserable.
Sure.
But it can be like so joyful when it's working, and you feel it when it's working. You feel it in the break room. You just feel it in the air. And how do you? I guess this will be the last question. But how do you deal with a job like culture management where you can never succeed? And I don't mean you can't have a positive culture. I just mean that you said it. You're always learning. You're always growing. Everything's always changing. Like, how do you stay motivated to keep focused on it when it's like a axiomatically like impossible task to win at?
But I think that's an analog to working in games. There is always a new challenge, whether you're the developer and there's a new game you're coming out every 3 to 5 years, and there's a whole new set of problems around the game that you're developing. Or if you work at a console maker, there's a new console every 7 to 10 years, and that's a whole new problem space. I think this is just an extension of it. And that's what's so fascinating for me. I was attracted by the games industry and I stayed in games because there's always a new problem to solve. And the time scales can be really short to very long. And I find culture to be the exact same thing. There's these incredible problems to always solve. It's ever changing and keeps it fresh. And the timescales can be really big. And that's what I really like. I like thinking about things in a 3 to 5 to 10 year timescale and go, what are the problems that we're trying to anticipate? But let's keep the flexibility to roll with the punches when that changes, because there's always going to be something new. There's going to be new information, new ways of doing things, new energy, new ideas coming in. And that's what's fascinating for me personally is always been, it's just that there's always a new problem to solve.
That's awesome. All right. I think we'll leave it there. That's a great way to finish it out. So thanks so much for coming out to talk to us. And congratulations on all your success. And I'm pleased that I didn't fan out on Last of Us and other things as much as I thought.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I have to say I'm so humbled to be on the Game Maker's Notebook. I always look up to this podcast, and it's one of the ones on regular rotation. So I can't say how honored I am to be here.